welcome to the Dusty Discipleship Podcast. In Jesus' day, a disciple wanted to follow so closely to their teacher, their rabbi, that they hoped that the dust from his feet would cover them. And that's what we're after here, as we interact with God's Word, looking to walk closely behind our teacher, our Savior, our King, Jesus, and hoping to follow so closely behind him that the dust of his feet covers us. My name is Mitch, and today we're continuing our journey through the Gospel of Matthew, moving into chapter 8. Over the last 3 episodes, we walked through the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus has been and had taught us what life under God's reign can look like. Jesus showed us the good life, challenged our hidden motives, and ultimately, I think, calls us to build our lives on a solid foundation. And the Sermon on the Mount ends with an interesting observation. Matthew tells us that the crowds were amazed because Jesus taught as one having authority. Authority. The last major idea Matthew leaves us with before Jesus comes down the mountain. And as chapter 8 begins, Matthew starts answering, I think, a very important question for us. What happens when the authority of Jesus collides with our real life? You see, it's one thing to hear Jesus teach about the kingdom, and it's another thing to trust him when you're sick, when your plans get interrupted, when a storm hits, or even when life feels out of control. Matthew 8 is filled with miracles. But I think the miracles are actually serving a larger purpose, because Matthew is showing us who Jesus is. Again and again, Jesus will reveal in this chapter his authority. And every person who encounters that authority has to decide how they will respond, which is where faith comes in. Because faith is not just simply believing that Jesus exists. Faith is recognizing that Jesus has authority and trusting him enough to build your life around him. Today, we're going to look at 4 areas where Jesus demonstrates his authority and ask ourselves a simple question after each one. If Jesus truly has authority here, what does faith look like? Again, my name is Mitch. I'm excited to jump into the Bible with you today. Let's jump on in. Welcome back to the Dusty Discipleship Podcast. We're on Matthew chapter 8, episode 8, really the 9th episode of this podcast. I hope your week has been going well, depending on when you're listening to this. If you're listening to it, maybe it's a braggadocious statement for me to just assume that someone's listening. I said it last week, and I'll probably say it in every episode. I'm just really enjoying slowly walking through the book of Matthew like this. I'm not somebody who normally is comfortable taking time like this and moving slowly. And hopefully you're doing the same. Hopefully this has been maybe something for you that you're able to interact with and just kind of follow along with as you try to become a little dustier, to use the phrase that this podcast really is built on, wanting to be more like King Jesus. And we just got out of the Sermon on the Mount. And there's so much within that 3-chapter section of Matthew that you could really just chew on that for so long. And I've said it before, but we are to meditate on the Word of God day and night. And that's a hard challenge for a lot of us. I've been thinking a lot about biblical literacy and just how little we as Christians and we as human beings know about the Bible. For many of us, the introductions we've had have just been the big name Bible stories of people like Moses and David and Jonah. And we know about Jesus, we know about a cross, we know about a resurrection, and we're left wanting in so many areas of our life. And for the authors of the Bible and for Jesus himself, the Word of God was just such a central fact, maybe theme, maybe pillar of their discipleship journey. And I think for so many of us, this is a book we often overlook. And I've just been really inspired in my own life to try and change that. And so here we are, Matthew chapter 8. Hopefully you'll take the time to actually read through it. But as I was really reading through this chapter, the 2 words authority and faith just kept coming back to me. And as you really look at this chapter, it's hard not to see it. And for this first section, which is really like that first 17 or 18 verses, we meet 3 different people. who come from three different completely situations. The first is a Jewish leper, a man who is unclean by the law, cut off from his community, probably hadn't been touched by another human being in years. The second is a Roman centurion, a Gentile, a soldier who is occupying Israel, and the last person you expect to show up in a healing story revolving around a Jewish rabbi. And the last person is Peter's mother-in-law. And we don't get a dramatic backstory. We don't get a crisis of faith from her. But she's just a woman with a fever. And she has people who love her. And what Matthew's doing here is, it really seems like he's widening the circle on purpose. The leper obviously represents the religiously excluded. And if he represents that, the centurion represents the people who are on the outside, both ethnically and politically. And I think Peter's mother-in-law represents ordinary, everyday life. And if you take that stance and you look at it that way, you see Jesus moving towards all three of them. And I think Matthew's point right out of the gate is that the kingdom is not for just one kind of person. And I want us to think about that as we interact with Jesus, especially here in Matthew. There is a thought process that Matthew is written to the mumzer, I believe it's a Jewish word. It might be an Aramaic word. I will link an article to a guy by the name of Marty Solomon who talks a bit about this, and he has some other scholarly work that he's done on it as well. But the idea of a mumzer is someone who is born out of wedlock or not really fit to be a part of the family. Legitimately might be a better way to put it. And you see that just kind of woven through the people Jesus interacts with. Even Jesus is kind of portrayed that way here, as if you're looking at the Jesus story from the outside in, without the context of knowing what happens with Mary and Joseph, it would be easy to see how it's a very unorthodox story. And it all starts here in Matthew 8 with this story of the leper, right? And so the leper says here in the chapter, "Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean." And really, that's a remarkable sentence. The leper's not asking Jesus whether he's able. He's already settled that question. And what he's uncertain about is whether Jesus wants to. Think about this leper's life must have looked like. He's been required to warn people to stay away from him. He's excluded probably from worship, from community, from family. He's been told, maybe implicitly or at least explicitly, that his condition makes him untouchable. So his question makes sense. This leper here isn't like doubting Jesus' power. He's doubting whether someone like him, excluded, unclean on the outside, would be someone Jesus would choose to help. And Jesus touches him. Think about that. A Jewish teacher touching a leper. Under the law, touching a leper makes you unclean, but Jesus does it anyway. And instead of Jesus becoming unclean, the leper becomes clean. And what Matthew is doing here is, he's not just picturing a healing. It's a picture of what Jesus often does with our own brokenness in moving towards it and not being repelled or repulsed might be a great way to put it. But rather, Jesus absorbs it. And we have to think about that. We have to think about our own broken lives. And, this whole first section here with the leper, the centurion, and Peter's mother-in-law really does show that Jesus has authority over human brokenness. And if I can be transparent in my own life, I've often felt like a person who is repulsive. I don't love that word because I don't think I'm physically repulsive, but I feel very much spiritually and emotionally repulsive. I feel like a burden quite a bit in my life. And I feel like someone who I've used the word can be often toxic sludge, and just the brokenness in my own mind of being a person who struggles with self-esteem, where on the outside I might look like a guy who will have a podcast because he loves to talk about the Bible and have it all put together. But really on the inside, I'm a scared little boy, just so scared to be rejected, abandoned, and just feel so toxic. And yet Jesus does something here in this story that I think speaks in my own life and maybe even speaks in yours. And it's not that Jesus sees us the way we see ourselves, but rather we have to understand that we can bring what is broken to Jesus, because Jesus wants to deal with it. He wants to touch it. He wants to absorb it. He wants to make it whole. And it's just so countercultural to the way we think about ourselves, isn't it? And as you move into the next person Jesus interacts with here in the story, who's the centurion, where he walks up to Jesus and asks him to heal his servant. And Jesus offers to come to the guy's house, and the centurion stops him. Now, even Jesus offering to go to his house is, again, a statement of potentially making himself unclean, depending on the state of this centurion's house. But essentially, the centurion says, you don't have to come, Jesus. Just say the word. If you haven't yet, watching The Chosen, I think, gives a lot of people who are struggling to maybe interact with the Bible some great language and just audio-visual stimulus to be able to like look at the Bible and see pictures of it. And this scene in The Chosen is maybe one of my favorites, where you see the growth from this Roman centurion and just what they do with it and their interpretation of it, of course. And really here in this story in the Bible, the centurion understands that he has authority. He says that. He goes, I can tell people to go and they go. I can tell people to stay and they stay. And he understands that he has authority, and he applies that same logic to Jesus. And really, this might be the sharpest display of faith in the entire chapter. The centurion recognizes something about Jesus that maybe even those on the inside haven't fully grasped yet. That the word of Jesus is enough. That he can say something and it will happen. And I think Matthew's filing this story here deliberately. You see, we just finished the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus calls people to build their lives on his words. The centurion is the first person who actually demonstrates what this life looks like. He trusts the word of Jesus without needing anyone else to confirm it. And that's where Jesus will say something like here in, I think it's verse 13, where he says, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. And we see again just Jesus having authority over human brokenness, both obviously with the servant and the centurion, but also just in his own life. And the last person you interact with here in the chapter is, or at least this section of the chapter, I should say, is Peter's mother-in-law. And this one's often short and easy to rush past. Because Jesus comes to Peter's house, he sees his mother-in-law in bed with a fever. He touches her hand and she gets up and begins serving. And I think after the two big stories of a leper and a centurion, it's easy to see this as like a throwaway miracle, because it's in between two dramatic stories. But I think Matthew is doing something very intentional with this sequence. Because Jesus heals her, she gets up, and then she serves. And the idea that Matthew, I think, is trying to drive home here is that when you are restored in the kingdom, it's going to lead you somewhere. Being made whole isn't the destination. It's just what makes the next thing possible. She isn't healed so that she can stay in bed. I think she's healed so that she can re-enter her life, so she can go back to doing what she was doing in her house, in her service. And this pattern does run through the rest of the chapter, that healing isn't just about returning to a state of neutral, but it's about being free to participate in something. Because like in this first section where Jesus has authority over what's broken, whether it's disease, isolation, uncleanness, suffering, all of it falls under his authority. And so this first question I want to ask you as you listen today is, what's broken in your life? And why haven't you brought it to Jesus yet? Is it the assumption that he won't do anything with it? Is it the assumption that it's too much for him? Is it the assumption that he doesn't have power over it? Is it the assumption that once he does something with it, I don't want to have to get up and serve and go and do? And all of those aren't reasons that we don't bring something to Jesus. And as you move into the next section, which really is just 4 or 5 verses, you see that not only does Jesus have authority over human brokenness, but he also has authority over allegiance. Matthew will sandwich this little next section here, which is like verses 18 to 22, between miracle stories, right? So you got healings in the first 17 verses with a leper, a centurion, and Peter's mother-in-law. And then the whole idea of the miracle with the storm here at the end of this section. And right in the middle, 2 people try to follow Jesus. And Matthew's asking us, okay, so you've seen miracles. You've seen Jesus heal a leper, a centurion's servant, a sick woman. Now, what are you going to do with that? And 2 people have answers for Jesus, where one of them will say, and he's a scribe, and he goes, "Teacher, I'll follow you wherever you go." And it really does sound like the perfect answer. Complete commitment, no conditions. And Jesus responds by describing the reality of what that means. When he says, foxes have dens, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Jesus isn't trying to discourage the guy. He's just being honest with him. Following Jesus is not a path to comfort. It doesn't come with security or stability. Or maybe I should say it doesn't come with security or stability as the world defines them. The man says, wherever you go, and Jesus asks him whether he really means that. And then right after that, the second man is already a disciple of Jesus, and he asks Jesus if he can go first and bury his father. And I want to be careful because we have to understand the context of this. In Jesus' day, burying your father was one of the most sacred obligations a son had. This wasn't a small ask. Jesus is invoking something everyone who would have heard what was going on would have considered this a non-negotiable. Absolutely, go and bury your father. And so that's why Jesus' response is so jarring here. Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. And what Jesus is saying is that the kingdom has arrived. The kingdom changes the order of every obligation. Not because your family doesn't matter. The whole New Testament says that family does matter, but because there is something that takes precedence over even the most sacred duties that you might have. Following Jesus is not just one commitment among many. It is the commitment that orders all the other commitments in your world. The delay isn't really about the burial. The delay was saying, not yet. I'm not going to follow you just yet. And Jesus is drawing a line between that and actual discipleship. And I think what Matthew's doing by placing this right after these healing stories with the leper and the centurion and Peter's mother-in-law is he's saying that most people who encounter Jesus in chapter 8 here don't struggle to believe that Jesus is powerful. The leper believes, the centurion believes, I'm sure Peter's mother-in-law believes. The evidence is really accumulating. The harder question is whether people are going to let that authority reorganize their lives. Because it is possible to be deeply impressed by Jesus and still hold back the one thing he's asking for. Because Jesus is not simply offering help into your life. He's claiming loyalty. He wants authority not just over what's broken, but over the direction of your life. And so maybe where that first section asks us what's broken and how can we give it to Jesus, this second section, I think, asks you to surrender your plans to Jesus and to make Jesus' priorities become yours. And that's a hard thought, right? That's a really hard thought to have, especially if you grow up in an American culture that is so hell-bent to shove freedom down your throat. At the time of this recording, it's early June 2026. We are about actually when I am recording this, we're about exactly 30 days away from July 4th. And that'll be the 250th anniversary of America declaring its freedom from England. And you think about just the price we as Americans put on freedom and what that looks like. And so often we want to have our priorities be ours and let Jesus kind of fit in wherever he fits in. And these two stories of these two guys who want to follow Jesus show that that's not how it works when you follow Jesus. Jesus has authority over your allegiance. If you're going to follow Jesus, he has to have authority over your allegiance. But not only that, this next section, I think, shows that Jesus has authority over your circumstances. Because the disciples get into a boat because Jesus tells them to. Because that detail does matter. This is not a storm that found them when they were doing their own thing. They are in the storm because they followed and obeyed Jesus. Jesus says, let's go. They follow. And now they're in the boat and it's filling with water. Because obedience doesn't just exempt you from difficulty. And that's one of the hardest lessons, I think, in this whole chapter as I was reading it. Matthew puts it right in the middle of all this. Because the picture paints it, right? The disciples are panicking. Jesus is asleep. And we have to think about what that contrast communicates. We have 12 guys who are awake, scared. They are experienced fishermen who know exactly how bad this is going to be. They're terrified. And Jesus is asleep. He's not absent. He's not indifferent. He's asleep, resting in the middle of a storm that his disciples can't survive. So they wake him up. Their words land somewhere between a prayer and an accusation where they say, Lord, save us. We're perishing. And Jesus responds to that. He responds to their fear before he even responds to the weather. He says, why are you afraid? Oh, you have little faith. And then like nothing, he stands up and calms the storm. I've thought a lot about the way that Matthew orders his operations here. He addresses their fear first. I don't think that's a throwaway sequence. I think instead what Matthew's doing here is he's identifying that real problem, not the storm, but what the storm reveals about their trust. And where we said that Jesus had authority over human brokenness or over allegiance, I think we really do see it here that the greatest miracle in this story might not be just calmed water. It's the invitation underneath that question, right? Where Jesus says something like, you can trust me in this, even here, even when it looks like I'm not paying attention. And I think this is where, at least one of the spots where Matthew's kind of pointing you back to the Sermon on the Mount. Because at the end of chapter 7, Jesus tells a parable about two builders, one who built on a rock, one who built on the sand. The storm comes for both of them, right? And the difference isn't whether the storm arrived, it's what kind of foundation had you built on. In chapter 8, a storm literally shows up, and now we find out what kind of foundation the disciples have. Because at this point in the story, it's shaky. It looks like sand, and Jesus is in the boat with them. He's teaching them something, right? They can't learn this on dry land. And you have to think about this in our own life, right? And this idea that Jesus does have authority over what you cannot control. The storms of our life don't catch him off guard. Our circumstances are not outside of his reach. And where we have to think about where in our life things are broken and whether we brought them to him, or like in the second section, maybe where we have our own plans, our own lives, and we need to surrender that to him. I think here we need to think about the outcomes that are out of our hands and trust those to Jesus. Because it leads us into the last section, which really was my favorite, where Jesus and his disciples get out of the boat, and immediately they're just encountered with two men who are severely demonized, violent, living among the tombs, so dangerous that no one can walk through that area. And the demons respond to Jesus. How creepy of a scenario, right? They don't question who he is. The demons don't ask for proof. They know exactly who they're standing in front of and what that means. They call Jesus the Son of God. They ask him whether he's come to torment them before their time. And they know what's coming. They know their dominion's at an end. And they're asking Jesus if he's starting that process. And Jesus sends them into a herd of pigs. And the pigs run into the sea and they drown. And the herdsmen in the city run and tell everyone what's happened. And I think this is right here where we see this idea of Jesus' authority. Because the demons identified Jesus correctly. But the townsmen come out and they ask Jesus to leave. They don't say why. Matthew doesn't tell us directly. Probably a combination of some things. Maybe fear, because this is just an unsettling situation. Could it be economics, that they just lost an entire herd of pigs? And maybe there's even something harder to name. Something maybe like if Jesus stays, more things are going to change, and I'm not ready for that change. And whatever the reason is, they prefer the version of their home where two violent men live in their tombs and no one goes near them, instead of the version where Jesus is present and rearranging things. That's not unique to just Gentile pig farmers. It's recognizable in all of our lives. Jesus' authority is disruptive. It doesn't fix what's broken and leave everything else alone. Instead, it fixes what is broken and then reorders our entire lives. And for some of us, that's too much. The two men who were healed aren't mentioned again in this passage. And I love this story even more in Mark. But instead, the townspeople response is what Matthew closes with. And I think Matthew's asking us to sit with that. Nothing is outside the authority of Jesus. We see both the idea that Jesus has authority over human brokenness or over our circumstances or over our allegiance. And lastly here, over the darkest of spiritual forces. But Jesus having authority and Jesus being welcome are two different things. Having authority doesn't mean that everyone accepts it. And as you read this chapter, I'm sorry, it almost makes me emotional talking about stuff like this, because I think we miss it so much as Christians. That Jesus does have authority. This whole chapter's about it. We see it in the way he heals people. We see it in the way he just speaks into the lives of two men as they want to follow him, and he demands their allegiance, and they walk away, and you have to imagine that it's just too much for them, almost like the rich young ruler. And then you see Jesus do it again with the disciples in the boat, where he shows them he has authority over their circumstances. And lastly here, over like even the darkest of the spiritual realms. And I think we ignore that so much. I think for many of us, Jesus is the token guy we put in our right pocket and we pull out when we need him. And we think about him when we are desperate. And for the rest of our lives, we never, ever, ever put him on the throne of our life. And that's a sad statement. Sad statement in my own life. It's a sad statement in the lives of just so many Christians around the world who want to follow Jesus in name only. Reminds me of that little parable in, I think it's Isaiah 5. It might be Isaiah 7, where 5 women grab hold of one man because the times have gotten so bad, and they say, let us just marry you in name only. And that story is doing something different completely, but that little picture there just reminds me so much of how my own life can be centered around Jesus, where I want to follow him in name only. I love the name Christian. I love the idea that people think I'm a Christian. I love the idea that I have Christian ideals and values. I'm trying to raise my kids as Christians. Yet when it comes time for Jesus to be disruptive, for him to tear down the strongholds of my life, for him to work and to do what he's called to do, what he wants to do in my life, I push back and I resist. And like at the end of the chapter, I'm much like these herdsmen who want to walk Jesus out of their town because I'd rather have 2 demon-possessed men running around that I can just ignore and leave off to the side of my heart as opposed to having Jesus do something with it. And man, that's a damning statement. I hope that as you listen, you welcome the authority of Jesus into every area of your life. We're not trying to manage Jesus from a distance. As you close today, as you listen to this, I think Matthew 8 leaves us with a simple, challenging question. Where is it hardest for you to trust the authority of Jesus right now? Maybe, like that first section, there's something broken in your life and you're wondering if Jesus is willing, if you're too toxic, if he can even do something with it. Maybe he's asking you to surrender something you've been holding on to. Maybe like the disciples, you're in the middle of a storm, wondering if Jesus is paying attention. Or lastly, maybe there's an area of your life where you're resisting his authority because you're afraid of what obedience might cost. Matthew's invitation here is not simply to admire Jesus. It's to trust him. The leper trusted him. The centurion trusted him. The disciples had to learn to trust him. And you're being invited to do the same. Because faith isn't just admiring Jesus from afar. Faith is reorganizing and recognizing that Jesus has authority and choosing to place your life under that authority. Think about that this week. Think about that as you walk out into a world that tells you that you have authority over your life, that you get to choose what feels good and you should do it. And hopefully you can be like the leper or the centurion, and you can be someone who puts their faith in Jesus and understands that his authority means that he's the king of your life. Next week, next time, we're going to continue into Matthew chapter 9, where I think Matthew keeps building the case for who Jesus is and what life will look like when the kingdom of heaven breaks into those ordinary moments of life. Until next time, keep following Jesus closely enough that the dust from his feet covers your life. Think about his authority. Think about where you need to place your faith in him and follow him a little bit more closely. Hopefully you find yourself a little dustier today than when you started it. Thank you so much for listening. Have a good rest of your week.